While most 6-year-olds bring toys to school, Emily brought her teddy bear into a mansion filled with silence and sorrow. Her mother, Rachel, was just the cleaning lady. The man who owned the house, broken, alone. Until a little girl walked into a room no one entered and handed him a bear named Mr. Snuggles. That simple act would change everything. A grieving father, a single mother, a child too brave for her age. Stay with us as we unfold a quiet, powerful story where healing begins in unexpected places and where one small act of kindness might be enough to mend a shattered life. The rain came down in sheets that morning, wild and sudden, and by 7:30 a.m., the school district had announced a full-day closure. Rachel Alvarez stared at her phone, heart thudding. She had already clocked in, already left the apartment with the assumption Emily would be in class by the time she arrived at the Hawthorne estate. But there she was, 6 years old, still in her unicorn pajamas, blinking up at her mother from the passenger seat with the kind of quiet trust that broke Rachel's heart. She debated calling her supervisor, debated asking for the day off, but the mortgage, groceries, and overdue electric bill all answered for her. No choice. She drove them both through the storm, praying the security guard wouldn't raise questions. He didn't. She entered through the service entrance as usual, whispering to Emily to stay by her side, be silent, be good. The house loomed large and cold, not from its temperature, but from its soul, cavernous, silent, and empty in the way only grief can empty a place. Rachel moved room to room with her supplies, glancing back often, but Emily was curious. That quiet curiosity, always gentle, always looking, pulled her away. Emily didn't run. She never did. Her steps were always soft, almost questioning, as if asking permission from the air itself before moving forward. She turned left instead of right, lured by something invisible that made her fingers tighten slightly around her teddy bear's leg. Her mother's voice grew faint as she followed a corridor she'd never noticed before. The hallway narrowed, the ceilings dipped slightly lower, and the walls changed hue, once stark white, now fading into pale blue. She stopped in front of a door that was half open. Something about it felt forgotten. She peeked in. The room was small, almost tucked away, but neat, untouched. A piano sat by the wall, its keys dull from dust. A bookshelf held picture frames, some tilted slightly. And in the chair by the window, unmoving, sat a man. Not just any man. The man her mother whispered about, the one who never spoke, the one who owned the house but hadn't lived in it since his daughter died. Emily had never seen William Hawthorne up close. He looked tired. His face didn't scare her, though. He looked like someone who had cried so hard, for so long, that he didn't remember how to stop. She stepped inside, slowly. Rachel didn't realize her daughter had gone until the room she was cleaning felt too quiet. She called her name once, sharply, then again with rising panic. She dropped the feather duster, heart pounding in her ears. She knew the rules. Emily wasn't supposed to be here at all, let alone roaming the halls of William Hawthorne's estate. She turned in place, thinking of every possible explanation she could give, how to beg to keep her job, how to apologize fast enough. Then from down the hall she heard a sound, not a scream, not a crash, a voice, Emily's voice, soft and steady. Rachel rushed toward it, following the echo of her daughter's small words, and stopped just outside the room. What she saw made her go still. Her daughter, barefoot and tiny, stood only a few feet from William Hawthorne. He didn't notice Rachel. His eyes were locked on Emily, who looked entirely calm, not defiant, not afraid. She held out something in both hands, something familiar. Mr. Snuggles. That scruffy old bear Emily had taken to school, to sleep, to dinner. The bear that had been sewn back together 3 times. Rachel opened her mouth to speak, to shout, to stop it. But then she saw William's hands. They didn't move right away. William simply stared, His eyes dropped to the bear, then to Emily's face. He blinked once, like waking from a deep, suffocating dream, and when he finally raised his hand to take the offering, it trembled. Not dramatically, not in a way that suggested weakness, but in a way that told Rachel something was cracking, something long frozen. William Hawthorne had not spoken a word to anyone outside of necessity in months. Not to the housekeeper, not to the groundskeeper, not to his mother even. Yet here he was, accepting a teddy bear from a child like it was sacred. Emily nodded solemnly when he took it, as though they had agreed on something unspoken. Rachel dared not move, afraid the moment would collapse if she breathed wrong. "He helps when I'm scared," Emily said, her voice so clear it pierced Rachel's chest. "You can borrow him." The room fell into a silence that wasn't empty. It was full, heavy. Rachel slowly stepped back unnoticed. She didn't want to interrupt whatever this was. Her child had crossed a line she didn't know existed, walked into grief, and sat down with it like it was a friend. William's fingers curled around the bear's plush body slowly, like he wasn't sure it would stay if he gripped too hard. He glanced down at the little thing, the uneven stitches, the missing button eye, the faded red ribbon around its neck. It wasn't just a toy. It was loved. It had clearly been loved for a long time. He turned it slightly in his hand, then looked back at Emily, who was watching him not with expectation, but simple patience. She wasn't trying to fix him. She wasn't trying to ask anything of him. She had simply offered him comfort. The kind of comfort only children know how to give, without conditions, without needing it returned. His mouth parted, but no words came out. Instead, he blinked. Once, twice, then again. And for the first time in nearly a year, something moved behind his eyes. Not just memory, not just pain. Something living, something beginning. He looked at Emily like he was seeing her for the first time, and maybe he was. Maybe he was seeing the world for the first time again. He held Mr. Snuggles to his chest, not tightly, but close enough. Rachel stayed by the doorway, hands clenched at her sides, unable to look away. She didn't know what this meant, if it was dangerous, if it was a line crossed, if she'd be punished or fired. But none of that mattered in that moment. She saw the way William's shoulders lowered just slightly, the way his eyes softened, the way Emily stood still, not asking for her bear back, just waiting to be sure he had it. She watched her daughter do something extraordinary without realizing it, bridge the impossible space between grief and grace with a gesture so small it should have been forgettable. But it wouldn't be. Rachel knew it. This would not be forgotten, not by her, not by William. Maybe not even by the house. Emily turned to go finally, but William raised a hand in a silent wait. "What's his name?" he asked, voice rough and unused. Emily beamed. "Mr. Snuggles." He nodded, then looked down at the bear in his hands again. "Mr. Snuggles," he repeated, as if trying the name on for the first time. Rachel exhaled quietly, and in the hush that followed, William Hawthorne blinked back, something other than emptiness. Rachel woke with a knot in her stomach. The memory of yesterday, Emily in that room, offering Mr. Snuggles like a peace treaty to the man no one dared to look in the eye, haunted her like a slow leak of panic. She practiced apologies in the mirror. Maybe if she led with, "I know she wasn't supposed to be there," or if she promised it would never happen again, maybe if she offered to take unpaid leave or even resign. The thought sliced her chest open, but the possibility felt real. She couldn't afford to lose this job, not now, not ever, but especially not now. She arrived at the estate early, her hands cold despite the warmth of the morning. She clocked in. She scrubbed the kitchen floor harder than usual. Hours passed. Nothing happened. No one summoned her, no one yelled for one. No letter arrived, no door slammed. When she finally saw William Hawthorne, it was brief, at the end of the hall, passing silently in his usual grey sweater. But this time, he looked at her. And then something stranger happened. He nodded. It was so slight she nearly missed it, but it was there. An acknowledgement, a shift. That tiny gesture stuck with her the rest of the day. William Hawthorne had never acknowledged her presence before, not like that. The staff always described him in hushed tones, like he was more legend than man, a tragic ghost haunting his own mansion. He rarely left his study. He never initiated conversation. But today, when Rachel walked past the second-floor corridor with her basket of folded linen, she saw him pause at the top of the stairs. He didn't speak, but he tilted his head ever so slightly. And then he said, "Is she feeling better?" Rachel froze. "I'm sorry," she asked, heart lurching. "Your daughter," he said. "She seemed unwell last week." There was no sarcasm, no edge, just quiet concern, or something adjacent to it. Rachel, unsure whether to correct him, simply replied, "She's doing fine. Thank you for asking." And then he nodded again, almost like he approved of her answer. She wanted to ask what he thought of what had happened. If he was upset, if he had told anyone, if she was in trouble, but the words died on her tongue. William turned and walked away, leaving her with more questions than answers. The following week, Rachel kept Emily home with her again, not because school was closed, but because the babysitter cancelled last minute, and this time she didn't try so hard to hide it. There was no panic this time, only a quiet, bracing sort of tension. When they arrived, Rachel expected to be stopped at the gate, but the guard waved her through with no more than a glance. Emily clutched a new drawing in her hand, folded 3 times and held with a sense of purpose. "It's for the man in the sad room," she told her mother confidently. "He should have a picture. It'll make his walls less lonely." Rachel almost said no, almost said, "Let me do my job first, or maybe later, or even don't go wandering off again." But instead, she just watched her daughter walk away, like she'd done this before, like this was something she and William had silently agreed upon. Rachel cleaned the baseboards with one eye on the hallway, but no screams came, no stern voices. Only the faint sound of a conversation she couldn't make out, and the soft knowledge that something had shifted again, not broken, not wrong, just different. Later that afternoon, when she went to collect Emily, she found her in the sitting room, cross-legged on the floor, coloring a new drawing with crayons she didn't recognize. They were newer, cleaner, not the stubby ones from home. William sat nearby, not close enough to touch, but near enough to be present. He didn't speak when Rachel entered. Neither did Emily. It was only after a long moment that he looked up at her and said, "She has a very steady hand." Rachel didn't know how to answer. Compliments weren't common currency in this house. "She practices a lot," she said quietly. William nodded once, like that explained something. Rachel crouched beside her daughter and whispered it was time to go. Emily stood, handed William the finished drawing, a picture of him beside what was clearly their house with a sun and a cherry tree, and said, "You can put it on the fridge." She didn't wait for a response. She just smiled and left the room. Rachel followed, glancing back. William was still staring at the paper in his hand, like it was some kind of fragile truth. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. The act itself had already changed him. Rachel sat awake that night, thinking. She wasn't used to uncertainty that felt like possibility. Usually uncertainty meant danger, a missed paycheck, a flat tire, a sudden eviction notice. But this was different. William wasn't warm, not exactly, but he wasn't cold anymore either. There was something between them now, not affection, maybe not even respect, but a strange kind of awareness. She noticed the way he paused now when she entered a room, not to reprimand, but to observe. He asked about Emily's shoes one day. "She likes stars?" he'd asked, noticing the glittery pattern. Rachel had nodded, unsure if it was small talk or something more. Another time, she walked into the hallway and found a children's book. Clean, hardcover, untouched, resting on the bench outside the kitchen. No note, no explanation. But she knew who it was for. These weren't grand gestures, they weren't even gestures of kindness in the traditional sense, but they were something, and more importantly, he allowed them, allowed her, allowed Emily. That was what felt strange and terrifying and impossible not to notice. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she knew something inside the mansion had changed. The mansion remained mostly silent, the way it always had, but the silence had weight now. It wasn't dead air anymore. It was expectant. Like the house itself had been holding its breath for months and had finally let out the tiniest exhale. Rachel had worked in places where nothing changed, where grief became wallpaper and time moved on without anyone noticing. But here she noticed everything. The missing coat on the hallway rack, the one William hadn't worn in months. The door to the blue room, once always shut, now slightly ajar. The dining room where Emily's purple cup, the one with stars, had been washed and left near the sink instead of buried at the back of the cupboard. Rachel didn't want to name what was happening. She didn't want to hope. Hope was dangerous. But she knew one thing for certain: the shadows in this house, the ones that had once stretched long and lifeless, had begun to shift. They no longer clung like ghosts. They moved. They listened. They breathed. The kitchen had never been off limits to Emily, though it wasn't exactly encouraged either. The cook, Mrs. Patterson, was kind but brisk, the kind of woman who liked order and routine, who never needed a recipe because she carried them all in her head. Emily had watched her from the doorway before, eyes wide, trying to guess what each spice jar was for, what filled the copper pots. But that morning was different. Emily wandered in with a purpose she didn't often wear on her small shoulders. She climbed onto a stool, legs swinging, and waited patiently until Mrs. Patterson turned around. "Do you know how to make chocolate chip pancakes?" she asked plainly. Mrs. Patterson, startled, paused. "I do." "Why?" Emily shrugged and looked down at her fingers. "My daddy used to make them. Before he went away." The room stilled a moment too long. Mrs. Patterson softened. "Well then," she said, tying her apron tighter, "I suppose today's a good day for pancakes." Rachel, walking in late from the linen closet, caught only the end of it. She opened her mouth to protest, to pull Emily back, to apologize, but before she could, she noticed someone else was listening. William stood in the corridor just past the kitchen's archway, half hidden, but clearly attentive. His hands were at his sides, but Rachel could tell he'd stopped moving the moment he heard the words, "Daddy used to make." His expression didn't shift dramatically, no furrowed brow, no sudden emotion, but something settled in him like a stone dropped quietly into water. He didn't say anything, didn't interrupt, just waited until Emily's attention was elsewhere, then turned and walked away. Rachel didn't follow him. She knew better than to chase silence with questions. Still, it left her uneasy. She didn't want Emily's memories to feel like trespasses. Later that afternoon, as Rachel dusted the library shelves, William entered without warning. It was the first time he'd approached her directly since... ever, really. He cleared his throat, awkward and unused to the act. "What does she like to eat?" Rachel froze mid-swipe. "I'm sorry?" He looked at her, his voice quiet but steady. "Emily, you said she's a picky eater." She blinked. "She likes strawberries and rice with butter and anything sweet, really. She loves pancakes." He nodded once. "The chocolate chip kind." She didn't know how to respond, so she only said, "Yes, like her father used to make." She didn't mention the years of cheap pancake mix, of mornings spent trying to recreate something Emily barely remembered. She didn't say how her daughter sometimes talked to the photo of her father when she thought Rachel wasn't listening. None of that mattered now. Not here, not in front of this man who seemed to hold all things at arm's length, yet somehow remembered a single detail from a child's offhand comment. The conversation ended as quickly as it began. William turned and left, offering no explanation. Rachel stood in the library a moment longer, processing. She didn't tell Emily. She didn't want to promise something she didn't understand. The next morning, though, brought the answer. Rachel arrived with Emily, walked her through the familiar hallway toward the back pantry, and paused at the threshold of the dining room. Her breath caught before she even understood why. There, beside the enormous walnut table that had only ever seated one, was a new place setting. A small chair, not one dragged in carelessly, but properly measured, pulled out just enough. Atop the white linen napkin was Emily's favorite cup, purple, stars around the rim, clean and waiting, like someone had made space for her on purpose. Rachel didn't move. She stood in the doorway as though the floor had turned unstable. Emily, still fiddling with the zipper on her coat, didn't notice the change right away. But when she did, her face lit up with the kind of light only children can radiate without caution. "That's my cup," she said, rushing forward. "That's my spot." Rachel tried to say something, to stop her, to ask her to slow down, but the words stayed locked behind a tight knot in her throat. Emily stood by the chair, hand resting on the polished arm, looking up at the towering seat beside her. Rachel followed her daughter's gaze and found William already seated. He wasn't eating, he wasn't speaking, he was simply waiting. Their eyes met across the length of the table, and this time he didn't look away. He looked directly at her, fully, steadily. "She can eat here," he said, voice rough but sure, "if she wants." Rachel didn't respond right away. The moment demanded something beyond language. She nodded once, unsure what this meant, what came next. But she knew this much. A line had been drawn, or perhaps, more accurately, erased. They sat like that for several seconds, a triangle formed of hesitation, curiosity, and something that could one day be comfort. Emily had already accepted the invitation without pause, climbing onto the chair, inspecting her utensils, asking Mrs. Patterson if there would be whipped cream. William didn't answer her directly, but his lips lifted in something that might have been the earliest roots of a smile. Rachel stood a little longer, unsure if she belonged in that room, in that space being gently cracked open. She didn't dare take a seat herself. Not yet. But she didn't leave either. William's eyes met hers again, not cold, not commanding, just present. Rachel gave a slow nod. She didn't understand this man, but in that moment she believed, maybe for the first time, that understanding wasn't required. Only presence, only permission. And right now he was giving that freely. Emily didn't ask if she could come back the next day. She simply ate her pancakes, chatted about her drawing from last week, and told William that his sad room should probably have a plant, or maybe a lamp that changed colors. William said nothing, but he listened, every word taken in like it mattered. When breakfast ended, Emily hopped down and ran off with a syrup-stained napkin still clutched in her hand. Rachel turned to leave, but paused once more at the doorway. William was still seated, still watching. But his hands rested flat on the table now, not clenched. And beside him Emily's purple cup remained, not cleared away, not hidden, left there intentionally, like a placeholder, a promise, a start. And Rachel understood. This wasn't an accident. This was a decision, a deliberate invitation. And it began with a small chair, already pulled out. Emily wasn't trying to be sneaky that evening. In fact, she'd asked Rachel earlier if the room with the music thing was still locked. Rachel, half distracted while folding towels, had barely registered the question. She'd said something like, "I think so, sweetheart," and expected that to be the end of it. But after dinner, which Emily had declared the best yet because Mrs. Patterson added whipped cream to her fruit, she slipped away while Rachel gathered dishes and chatted with one of the groundskeepers who'd come in for coffee. The hallway was dim, but Emily wasn't afraid. She moved the way only children do, as though the house now belonged to her in some small, rightful way. When she reached the music room, the door wasn't closed all the way. That was surprise number one. She pushed it gently, peeking in like someone checking if a dragon was asleep. The room greeted her with silence, not coldness. The piano, large, black and polished like a memory, waited near the far wall. Emily walked slowly toward it, dragging her fingers along the edge of the bench. She didn't sit. She just reached out, uncertain, and pressed one key. The note trembled into the air, soft and uncertain. The sound reached William before he registered what it was. He had been reading, or at least trying to, in the study, a mug of untouched tea beside him. He froze as soon as he heard it. A single note, then another. The sound was raw, uneven, not from someone who knew how to play, but someone exploring, curious, hesitant. He stood slowly. For a moment he didn't move, just stood there, listening. Then he walked, each step measured and reluctant, like approaching something sacred he hadn't been near in years. The closer he got, the more the music became clearer. Not a melody, not yet, just fingers touching ivory like they were asking permission. When he stepped into the room, he saw her, Emily, small and hunched forward, tongue tucked in concentration, pressing one note at a time. She didn't turn around. She didn't seem startled by his presence. She just shifted slightly on the bench, as if to make room for him. That small gesture, quiet and sure, undid something in him. He didn't speak. He just walked forward, sat beside her, and placed his right hand over the lower keys. She played another note. He echoed it. Rachel had gone searching for her daughter the moment she noticed she was missing. It was becoming a familiar pattern. Emily slipping into places she wasn't supposed to, places that carried weight, places that held silence like something valuable. But when she reached the top of the stairs and heard the faint, broken notes of a piano, she stopped mid-step. Her chest tightened, recognition colliding with fear. That piano hadn't made a sound in almost a year. She walked slowly toward the music room, afraid of what she might see, or worse, interrupt. But when she reached the doorway, she didn't step in. She stood there, motionless. Inside, William sat at the piano with Emily. Neither noticed her. They were both too focused, not on getting it right, but on remembering what right even sounded like. William's fingers were stiff at first, pressing keys like they might hurt him. But Emily leaned into him without touching, as if willing him to keep going. "I think it goes like this," she whispered, and pressed 3 soft notes in sequence. William paused, then tried to repeat them. He missed the third. Emily giggled. "That's okay. I forget it too sometimes." He exhaled, not quite a laugh, but almost. The lullaby came together in broken pieces. Emily hummed what she thought the tune might be, and William followed with hesitant chords. It wasn't perfect. The timing was off. The notes were fragile, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that they were playing it together. William hadn't touched the piano since Lily's funeral, not during the service, not after. Rachel remembered. She'd cleaned this room weeks after the tragedy, wiping tear stains from the very bench Emily now sat on. Back then, she'd closed the piano lid like sealing a tomb. But tonight, the lid was open. The keys were alive, and the man who had lost everything was sitting beside a little girl who didn't know how to read music, but knew how to offer her heart without hesitation. Rachel covered her mouth with one hand, blinking back tears. Not just at the beauty of the moment, but at the impossibility of it, at how a child's fingers could reopen what grief had nailed shut. William wasn't smiling, not really, but his expression had softened, the lines around his eyes no longer quite so sharp. And Emily, she looked proud, like she had built a bridge and watched someone cross it. After a few minutes, the music faded. Emily stopped playing first, her fingers still hovering above the keys. "That's all I remember," she said, her voice quiet but not apologetic. William nodded, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the piano. "Me too," he murmured. They sat there for a while longer, neither moving. Rachel didn't dare interrupt. She let the moment stretch, let the silence after the music feel like part of the song. Eventually, Emily turned toward him and asked, "Was this her piano?" William didn't answer immediately. He looked at the worn edges of the keys, the fingerprints left behind, the memory of smaller hands once dancing across them. "Yes," he said, "just that." Emily nodded. She had good taste. William's mouth twitched at the corner, something resembling amusement, or maybe just awe. And then Emily slipped off the bench, gave a small wave, and headed back toward the door, humming what little she remembered of the lullaby. William stayed behind, alone again, but not quite abandoned. Rachel stepped aside to let her daughter pass and watched William, still seated, staring at the piano, like it had spoken. For the first time in almost a year, William didn't close the piano lid. He didn't stand. He didn't retreat. He stayed. Rachel leaned against the wall just outside the room, hands trembling at her sides, her heart doing something strange, swelling and aching at once. She wiped her cheeks quietly. Not from sadness, from recognition, from awe. She had been in this house long enough to know what silence sounded like when it was full of loss. But now the silence had changed. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't hollow. It echoed. Something had been awakened, stirred by the gentlest of hands. And it wasn't just the piano. Rachel felt it in the way her daughter walked lighter lately, the way William looked a second longer when someone spoke, the way the house seemed to hum again, like breath moving through its bones. She stepped back once more, giving William the space he didn't ask for but might have needed. Inside, he lifted one hand, slowly, and let his fingers hover over the same notes they'd played minutes ago. He pressed them again, not to remember this time, but to keep from forgetting. The walls of the house weren't the only thing beginning to echo again. Margaret Hawthorne arrived without a call, a warning, or even the decency of knocking before the gate. She swept into the estate like a gust of cold wind, her heels clicking against the polished floors with the precision of a ticking clock. Rachel had only met her once before, briefly, but she remembered everything about her. The way her chin lifted when she spoke, how she never smiled with her eyes, how she made every room feel just a little too small. William hadn't mentioned she was coming, and the staff scrambled, unsure whether to greet or avoid her. Rachel, caught in the middle of preparing lunch for Emily, turned around to find Margaret already standing in the doorway, looking at her like she'd found a stain on silk. "You must be the housekeeper," she said, her voice dry as dust, "and the child's mother." Rachel straightened, holding back the defensive edge rising in her chest. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret nodded once, coolly. "So it's true." She said nothing more. She didn't need to. She turned away with a quiet scoff and continued her inspection of the house, but it wasn't the house she was really judging. Margaret moved through the estate like she owned every inch of it, which, legally speaking, she might still have believed she did. Her eyes missed nothing. The teddy bear on William's desk, the crayon drawings tacked to the refrigerator with polished silver magnets, the small chair still tucked beside the great dining table, its legs dusted clean, its presence deliberate. Rachel followed at a distance, stomach tightening with each room the woman entered. She didn't say anything, yet, but her silence spoke volumes. Her gaze lingered on every trace Emily had left, each one like a footprint in wet cement. Rachel tried not to be embarrassed by them. Emily had done nothing wrong, neither had she. And yet Margaret's presence made every innocent object feel like a transgression. By mid-afternoon, Rachel was emotionally exhausted. Emily had asked who the mean, fancy lady was, and Rachel gently corrected her tone, telling her to be polite. "But she looked at me like I wasn't supposed to be here," Emily whispered. Rachel didn't answer, because that was the part that stung. The unspoken truth that Margaret was thinking exactly that, even if she hadn't said it yet. Dinner came and went awkwardly. Margaret didn't sit at the head of the table, but she made her presence known. She commented on the food. Not quite what your father preferred. And the linen choice. Peculiar shade of ivory. William said almost nothing, responding only when necessary. He wasn't unkind. He was distant, as though retreating into the parts of himself he'd only just begun to abandon. Rachel watched him closely, wondering if this was who he became when his mother was around, if this was the version of him Margaret had helped shape. Emily, to her credit, kept to herself, quietly eating her fruit and occasionally whispering to Mr. Snuggles, who sat in her lap like a secret shield. Afterward, Rachel helped clear the table while William disappeared into his study. She didn't expect gratitude or even acknowledgement, but the silence felt louder tonight. Mrs. Patterson gave her a soft squeeze on the shoulder in passing. "She'll be gone soon," she whispered. Rachel nodded, but she wasn't sure if she believed it. Margaret didn't feel like someone who left things alone, especially when those things looked nothing like what she had planned. It wasn't until the evening that Margaret cornered her. Rachel was gathering laundry near the back stairs when she heard the unmistakable voice, calm and sharp as ever. "May I have a word?" Rachel turned, caught off guard. Margaret stood there in a crisp navy dress, arms crossed, the very image of refined confrontation. "Of course," Rachel said, swallowing the sudden dryness in her throat. Margaret stepped closer, her tone polite but cold. "You seem capable," she began. "Efficient. I've heard the kitchen runs smoothly under your supervision." Rachel gave a cautious nod. "Thank you," Margaret smiled thinly. "But I fear you may be reading too much into Mr. Hawthorne's silence." Rachel froze. "I'm not sure I understand." Margaret's gaze hardened. "His grief has made him vulnerable. He's lost perspective. Don't mistake his tolerance for affection. It's dangerous for both of you. You work here. That is your role, nothing more." The words didn't sting at first. They settled into Rachel's skin like smoke, slow and suffocating. She said nothing, unsure if any response would sound defensive or foolish. Margaret didn't wait for one. She offered a clipped nod and turned, heels tapping down the hallway, echoing like a warning. Rachel stood alone, fists clenched, jaw tight. She wanted to scream, to chase after that woman and tell her she didn't understand, that William wasn't just tolerating them, that this wasn't some fantasy she'd conjured up in her head. But the truth was, Rachel wasn't sure what this was either. And that was the part that broke her. She had been so careful not to hope, not to read into the quiet kindnesses, the chair, the cup, the piano. She had told herself she was imagining things, that she was grateful just to be working, to be surviving. But Margaret's words struck at a fear she hadn't let herself say out loud. What if this wasn't real? What if it all vanished the moment William's grief finally subsided? What if Emily was just a temporary comfort, a ghost standing in for another? That night, long after Emily had fallen asleep, Rachel sat at the foot of her bed and held her head in her hands. The tears came slowly at first, and then all at once. She didn't cry out of weakness. She didn't cry because Margaret had wounded her. She cried because she'd started to believe this place could be home, and now she wasn't sure if it ever really was. Rachel cried quietly, the way you do when you're afraid someone might hear you and take the last piece of something good away. She didn't want Emily to wake, didn't want her to ask questions. There was nothing she could explain. No words for the ache that had built in her chest since Margaret arrived. It wasn't just fear of losing a job. She'd lost jobs before. It was fear of losing something she hadn't even known she needed. The tenderness in William's eyes when he looked at Emily. The way Emily said his name, like he was already part of her world. The feeling of something growing slowly in a place where everything had once been frozen. Rachel wiped her face with the back of her sleeve and sat still, afraid that moving would break whatever fragile balance had been keeping them here. Margaret had said not to confuse grief for affection. But what if grief was how affection began? What if healing didn't arrive with smiles and declarations, but through silence, through music, through small chairs pulled out and lullabies half remembered? She didn't know. She only knew that tonight, for the first time in years, she cried, not from weakness, but from fear she was losing something she never expected to have. Emily had discovered the camera by accident, the way children always seem to find things adults forget exist. She had been exploring the attic, a place Rachel normally told her to avoid, but after 2 quiet weeks and a sense that the house itself had stopped resisting her presence, Rachel had finally relented. "Just don't touch anything sharp," she warned. Emily came back down half an hour later covered in dust and holding a box like it was treasure. Inside it, nestled among old scarves and brittle photo envelopes, was a vintage camera. Heavy, scratched, and beautiful. "Does it still work?" she asked, holding it up like it was magical. Rachel examined it, surprised to find that it still had a roll of unused film inside. That night, William walked into the kitchen to find Emily standing on a chair, trying to photograph a bowl of strawberries. "I'm making a memory book," she declared. "Memories go away if you don't catch them." "This helps." He didn't argue. He didn't smile either. He just nodded once and watched her. It was the first time Rachel saw him watching her daughter, not with caution, but with something closer to admiration. Over the next few days, Emily took pictures of everything. Mrs. Patterson whisking batter in the kitchen, the swing William had helped install in the backyard, the library, the staircases, the fridge covered in her crayon drawings. But what she wanted most was to photograph William. She tried to sneak one, but he caught her and turned his head before the shutter clicked. "You're not supposed to photograph people who don't want it," he said gently, not angrily. Emily frowned. "But you look different now," she replied. "Not as shadowy." He didn't respond to that. Instead, he walked away. She tried again 2 more times, both unsuccessful. Then, one afternoon, without asking, she raised the camera while he was helping Rachel move a stack of books and snapped it mid-movement. William looked up, surprised, mouth half open, as if he had been about to speak. Click. The image was imperfect, slightly tilted, a bit blurry, but in it William's expression was caught in a moment of softness. Not quite a smile, but something real, something no one had seen in a long time. Emily showed it to him the next morning. "Now you're not just sad anymore," she said, placing it into a frame she'd made out of cardboard and glitter. William didn't know what to say at first. He held the picture like it might crumble if he gripped it too tightly. The frame was crooked, uneven, one corner already peeling where too much glue had dried, but he didn't care. He stared at his own face longer than he wanted to admit, tracing the edges of a man he didn't quite recognize. There was weariness in the photo, of course, the kind no camera could hide. But there was something else too. Light, maybe, or the possibility of it. He thanked Emily quietly, awkwardly, but sincerely. She told him he could keep it on his desk or on his wall or maybe under his pillow, and skipped off. William placed it beside his bed, not even thinking twice. That night he caught himself looking at it again, reaching toward the frame, like he was checking if it was still real. He didn't smile, but he also didn't look away. Rachel passed by the room once and saw him through the crack in the door. Not grieving, not broken, just still. That image, William, still and steady, framed by something handmade, would live in her mind longer than the photograph itself ever could. Later that night, when Rachel returned to her room, she found something unexpected waiting for her. It wasn't much, a small, square object wrapped in brown paper, resting carefully on her pillow like it had been placed there with thought. Her heart beat faster as she approached, unsure if this was some formal gesture, some impersonal thank you. But when she unwrapped it, her breath caught in her throat. It was a photo album, brand new, untouched. The pages were blank, but not empty. On the inside cover was a note written in simple, unfamiliar handwriting. "Maybe it's time to start a new one." Rachel sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, holding the album in her lap as if it were made of glass. She ran her hand over the leather cover, feeling the weight of what it meant. It wasn't just a gift. It was permission, an invitation, maybe even a question. Are you ready? She hadn't made a photo album since before Emily was born. The last one she kept had stopped abruptly after her husband died. But here it was, a beginning, wrapped in silence and offered without demand. Rachel didn't cry immediately. She just stared at the album for a long time. The way you stare at something that touches a part of you you'd forgotten was still reachable. Then gently she opened to the first page. Blank. Waiting. Her fingers hovered over it, unsure what should go there. A picture of Emily, maybe. One of her laughing in the garden or drawing in the hallway. Or maybe the blurry photo of William, framed with glitter and love. She laughed softly at that thought, pressing the cover closed again. There was time. There would be time to fill it. And for the first time in years, she felt that possibility wasn't just fiction. She didn't know if this would last, or what tomorrow would bring, or if Margaret would return with more cold warnings and sharper threats. But in that moment, holding the album to her chest, she didn't feel afraid. She felt chosen, not in the grand romantic sense, but in the quiet way someone says, I see you, I trust you, I'm willing to begin again. And so she held the album close to her chest, like something sacred, because that's exactly what it was. Margaret returned like a storm that had never truly passed. This time, there was no polite inspection or veiled observation. She came with purpose, and everyone in the house could feel it. William was in his study when she entered, unannounced, uninvited. She didn't wait for him to look up before speaking. You're making a fool of yourself, she snapped, her voice tight with fury and disbelief. This has gone on long enough. That child and her mother, playing house in Lily's place, in her home. It's disgraceful. William said nothing at first. He simply placed his pen down with care, looked up and met his mother's eyes. They've done nothing wrong, he said quietly. Margaret's lip curled. They don't belong here. You're not thinking clearly. You've let sentiment replace sense. You're embarrassed yourself. You're weakening everything this family built. William stood, not to intimidate, but to close the space between them with calm authority. And what if they do belong here? He asked. What if what I built before was never enough? Margaret froze, stunned into silence. Not because he yelled, he hadn't, but because he challenged her with something far more dangerous, conviction. Rachel hadn't meant to eavesdrop. She'd come to ask William if he needed anything before she left for the evening. She never expected to hear voices raised, especially not his mother's, slicing through the hallway with entitlement and disdain. But what stopped her in her tracks wasn't Margaret's voice, it was William's, calm, firm, and deliberate. What if they do? It echoed through her like a door opening and slamming shut at the same time. She stepped back slowly, heart pounding in her chest, unsure if she had heard what she thought she had. She didn't wait for more. She turned, walked quickly to the back stairs, and gathered Emily from the library. Put your things away, sweetheart, she whispered. We're going to leave tonight. Emily looked up, confused. Why? Rachel forced a smile, the kind that barely held. Sometimes it's better to go before someone asks you to. Emily didn't question her. She packed her crayons, folded her drawing, and grabbed Mr. Snuggles with one hand. Rachel worked in silence, stuffing clothes into the worn duffel she kept by the door, not angrily, not even tearfully, just with resignation. The kind you carry when you've learned not to overstay where you're not welcome. She didn't leave a note. She didn't say goodbye to Mrs. Patterson or anyone else. It felt cleaner this way, quiet, quick. The car keys were in her coat pocket, and Emily's coat was zipped all the way up despite the warm air outside. Rachel stood by the door with the bag at her feet, her hand wrapped around the doorknob, waiting for one last moment of strength to push it open. Maybe William wouldn't notice until the morning. Maybe he'd be relieved. Maybe everything Margaret said had only confirmed what he was already thinking, that Rachel and Emily were temporary, convenient, an emotional crutch. Rachel closed her eyes and tried to breathe. She told herself it didn't hurt, that it was better this way, that they'd be okay. They always were. Emily looked up at her and asked, "Did we do something bad?" Rachel's throat tightened. "No, baby, we just don't fit here." That was the moment William appeared. His footsteps weren't hurried, but the urgency in his face said everything. He looked between the bag, the coats, the door, and then at Rachel, his eyes locked onto hers. "Please," he said, his voice cracking. "Don't go." Rachel froze. She hadn't expected him to come, let alone say that. She stared at him, her hand still on the door, trying to interpret the look on his face. He wasn't angry. He wasn't confused. He looked afraid, not of her, but of something deeper, of being left behind again. "You don't have to say that," she said softly, trying to maintain composure. "It's fine. You don't owe us anything." William took a step forward. "You think this is about owing you something?" His voice trembled, but not with rage. "I was alone before you came, not just in this house, in everything. Then you were here, she was here, and I—" He stopped himself, trying to steady his breathing. "I don't want to be alone again." Rachel didn't know what to do with those words. They cracked something in her that had been held together by necessity for years. "You don't have to say it just because your mother disapproves of us," she whispered. "I'm not." William's eyes glistened. "I'm saying it because I don't want you to go." Emily tugged gently at her mother's sleeve, sensing the shift. Rachel looked at her daughter, then back at the man standing in front of them, asking them, not forcing, not pleading, just asking. Rachel felt the weight of all the years she had spent preparing to leave before being pushed, all the times she packed up her life before someone told her she wasn't enough. It had become second nature. Stay invisible. Stay temporary. Don't make yourself too comfortable. But here was William, not giving her orders, not telling her she belonged, just telling her that her absence would matter. And it was that, not any declaration of love or safety, that unraveled her. The simple human truth that someone would feel her leaving. She stepped away from the door. Her hand slipped from the knob. She didn't move toward him, didn't say anything dramatic. She just let the bag fall gently to the floor. William exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for months. Emily hugged Mr. Snuggles tighter and looked between them, waiting for someone to explain. But neither adult spoke. They didn't need to. The words had already been said, the ones that hurt and the ones that healed. And so, as they stood in the quiet entryway, hearts racing, decisions made, it was William who broke the silence, not with demands or explanations, but with the truth that had waited far too long to be spoken. "Please, don't go. I was alone before you came. I don't want to be again." The day had unfolded quietly, with a kind of stillness that didn't feel heavy or sad, just gentle. Emily had spent the morning drawing on the kitchen floor while Rachel scrubbed the sink and chatted with Mrs. Patterson about lemon polish. William had been outside, pruning one of the shrubs that had grown wild near the old swing. It was the kind of day where nothing urgent needed doing, and no one felt rushed to fill the silence. In the early afternoon, Emily wandered into the garden with a juice box in one hand and Mr. Snuggles tucked under her arm. She spotted William, sitting alone on the bench beneath the cherry tree, the one Rachel always glanced at but never dared to sit on herself. Without hesitation, Emily made her way over and climbed up beside him, legs dangling as they swung back and forth without touching the ground. William didn't react at first. He just let her sit. But when she leaned her small head against his arm and let out a soft sigh, he turned slightly, acknowledging her presence with a nod, the kind that said "You're welcome here," without needing to speak. They sat like that for a long while, watching the branches sway, saying nothing of importance. Emily began telling him about her newest drawing, a castle made of pancakes, guarded by a dragon who only ate whipped cream. William listened, really listened, nodding when appropriate, offering small smiles that were real, not practiced. Then, after a long pause in their conversation, Emily tilted her head up to look at him. "Do you think your little girl would have liked me?" She asked, the question landing with the kind of weight children don't always realize they carry. William froze. The muscles in his jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. He didn't try to deflect, or change the subject, or pretend he hadn't heard. For several long seconds he simply sat there, stunned by the simplicity of it, the way it cracked something open in him that he'd kept sealed shut for months. Finally, he reached over and pulled her gently against his side, one arm resting across her small shoulders, not squeezing, just holding. He didn't speak, he couldn't, but he didn't need to. That gesture, silent, steady, said everything. Inside the house, Rachel had been watching from the window above the sink. She hadn't meant to spy, but when she saw them outside together, something told her not to interrupt. Her heart ached with something complicated, not jealousy, but something close to the fear of what came next. She had been careful not to expect anything, even now. But watching William with Emily, watching the way he responded to her without pulling away, reminded her that healing never looked the same twice. Later, as she folded laundry upstairs, she heard soft footsteps down the hall, and something in her gut told her that whatever had shifted under the cherry tree wasn't finished yet. A few minutes later, William appeared at her doorway. He didn't knock, didn't hesitate. "Can you both come with me?" he asked. Rachel looked up, surprised not just by the invitation, but by the tone of his voice. It wasn't forced. It wasn't careful. It was open. She nodded once, called for Emily, and followed him without question. She didn't know where they were going, not until he stopped at the door that had been locked since before she started working here. The door to the room had been passed 100 times in silence. No one spoke of it, no one dared touch it. Rachel had never been inside, not even once. She had dusted around it, cleaned the floor in front of it, wiped down the doorknob without turning it. The energy surrounding it had always been unmistakable, sacred and untouchable, like a wound that hadn't scarred over. But tonight, William opened it. The key clicked in the lock with no ceremony, no speech, just the soft sound of a decision finally made. Rachel stepped in behind him, holding Emily's hand. The room was still, nothing had been moved. A shelf of children's books stood in the corner, a bed with a quilt folded neatly at the edge, a few toys, untouched but clearly once loved. William didn't cry. His face was unreadable, but his body didn't carry the stiffness it usually did. He walked to the middle of the room, then slowly turned around to face them. "Her name was Lily," he said quietly. "She had your courage." He was looking at Emily, but the words felt like they wrapped around all of them. It was the first time he'd said her name in 11 months. Emily squeezed his hand. She didn't say much, just nodded with a solemn kind of understanding only kids can offer. Rachel felt the air in her lungs shift. William had said her name, out loud, not whispered, not buried in pain, spoken. A name returned to the room that had once been full of it. "Lily," Emily repeated softly. "That's a pretty name." William gave a quiet nod, and something in his posture changed. His shoulders looser, the way he stood less like someone guarding a memory and more like someone finally sharing one. He moved toward the shelf and gently picked up a small stuffed animal that had faded with time. He didn't hand it to Emily. He just looked at it, then placed it back. Rachel remained near the doorway, unsure whether to speak or step forward, but William turned to her next, eyes steady. "I think she would have liked you both," he said. Rachel's breath caught. There was no performance in his voice, just truth. And beneath it, the foundation of something starting to rebuild, not to replace what was lost, but to honor it by making room for what remained. That night, the house didn't feel any different in temperature or sound, but Rachel knew something fundamental had shifted. Not just in the room, or in William, but in the story they were all slowly beginning to write together. Lily's name had been spoken. The room had been opened. And in doing so, the silence that had once protected that pain had begun to soften. Rachel tucked Emily into bed later and kissed her forehead, whispering, "You were very kind today." Emily, already half asleep, murmured, "I just wanted to know if she would have liked me." Rachel brushed a curl from her daughter's cheek. "I think she would have loved you." Down the hall, William sat in a chair in Lily's room, just breathing. He didn't cry, but for the first time he didn't need to. And as the day came to a quiet close, the words that began, it still lingered, gentle and brave. "Do you think your little girl would have liked me?" Spring arrived as if someone had quietly unlocked a door that had been closed too long. The garden that had once stood wild and unkempt now hummed with small signs of life, not in some magical burst of color, but through careful, thoughtful touches. It was Emily's idea to plant flowers. She had come to Rachel one morning with a stack of seed packets, her hands already dirty from digging around the tool shed. "They need names," she'd said with absolute certainty. "Flowers grow better when they know who they're growing for." Rachel had smiled, amused but curious, and let her lead the way. Emily planted the first near the edge of the cherry tree roots and called it Lily's flower. She pressed the soil down like it was a blanket being tucked in for sleep. The second she named Mom's Hope, and she planted it beside the garden bench where Rachel liked to read. And the third, a bright marigold that stood proudly despite its small size, was planted directly in front of the swing William had built for her. "This one's William's smile," she said without looking up. William, who had been tightening the bolts on the swing nearby, paused but didn't correct her. William hadn't intended to build a swing. He'd gone out to trim a branch that had been scraping against the window, but Emily had followed him, chattering about how perfect that tree would be if only it had something fun on it. She had drawn diagrams. She had described the mechanics in 6-year-old terms. She had convinced him. And so, a week later, he'd stood under that very branch, covered in sawdust and rope fibers, trying to remember the last time he'd used his hands for something that wasn't maintenance or repair. The swing was simple, sturdy, and not particularly elegant, but to Emily it was magic. The first time she sat on it and shouted, "Higher!" with her feet kicking the air, William felt something shift in him again. Not like a revelation, more like a quiet assurance. This was what it looked like to rebuild. Rachel had watched it all happen without interrupting. She cooked more now, real meals, not just quick fixes. She laughed more often, sometimes without realizing it. And though none of them ever said it out loud, it was obvious to everyone. The house had changed, not just the walls, not just the garden, the people, the rhythm, the way they fit together. But comfort is never left alone for too long. It was mid-morning when Margaret returned, uninvited as always, but this time she wasn't alone. 2 lawyers flanked her, briefcases in hand, their presence sterile and deliberate. Rachel had seen the car arrive and instinctively gone to find Emily, pulling her gently inside. William met his mother in the sitting room, standing rather than sitting, arms crossed not in defiance, but in restraint. Margaret didn't waste time. "This has gone far enough," she said, voice cold and clipped. "You're no longer thinking clearly." William raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "You're making decisions with your heart," she added, gesturing vaguely toward the garden, toward the house. "You'll regret it." One of the lawyers opened a folder and began listing property clauses and estate control documents, explaining in practiced language how Margaret had authority to step in should the estate be mishandled emotionally. William barely blinked. He listened to every word with stillness. Rachel stood just behind the doorframe, holding Emily's hand and trying not to let her pulse race. This was the moment she'd always feared, that everything could be taken away, not because they had done something wrong, but because they dared to belong. When the lawyer finished his explanation, Margaret turned her full attention to her son. "You don't see what you're doing. You've invited strangers into our grief. You've turned this place into a daycare. It's shameful." William didn't respond immediately. His eyes flicked toward the hallway where Rachel and Emily stood, not hiding, just waiting. He didn't look angry. He looked resolute. "You keep calling them strangers," he said slowly, "but they're the only people who've made this house feel alive again." Margaret stepped forward. "She is not family. That child is not Lily. You're making a fool of yourself." William's voice stayed level. "I never wanted to replace Lily, and I'm not a fool. I'm a man who's learning how to live again, with people who remind me that it's still possible." Margaret's mouth opened, but he cut her off. "You want control. You can keep the title. I'll take the life that's growing in that garden." And with that, he took the folder, flipped to the final page, and signed. The room went quiet. Margaret's face turned to stone. The lawyers exchanged glances. William handed the folder back without ceremony. "You don't make the rules here anymore." Rachel didn't move at first. She wasn't sure she could. Emily clung to her side, sensing the tension, but not understanding all of it. William walked past the lawyers, past his mother, and came directly to them. "It's done," he said softly. "She's out." Rachel looked at him, unsure what to say. "Are you sure?" she asked. William nodded. "She said I'd regret it if I chose with my heart. For once, I'm proud of that." Rachel felt her throat tighten. Not because of fear, not anymore, but because no one had ever said something like that about her, or about them. She glanced down at Emily, who smiled up at William like nothing had ever been in question. "Can we plant another flower?" she asked. "One for today." William chuckled, the sound still foreign but growing more natural. "Yes," he said, "let's do that." Margaret left without a word, lawyers in tow, her presence fading behind the sound of the swing, creaking in the wind. William reached for Rachel's hand, just briefly, and then for Emily's. Together, they walked back outside. And behind them, untouched by lawyers or judgment, the garden continued blooming. On the anniversary of Lily's passing, the house was still. Not silent the way it once had been, that cold, hollow silence that hung in the air like grief wearing a suit, but still in the way of reverence. No one whispered, but voices were soft. No doors slammed, but not from fear. William had woken up before sunrise, knowing the date before his eyes even found the clock. He hadn't spoken much that morning. He didn't need to. He made himself a cup of coffee, skipped breakfast, and climbed the stairs with a slow, deliberate pace. He hadn't planned to sit in Lily's room. Not consciously, but his body carried him there, the way a heart returns to a memory when it's ready to face it. The room had changed. It no longer felt like a monument to loss, but rather a space that had been lived in again, respectfully, tenderly. A shelf with new books now stood where the dust had once settled. The quilt had been refolded by Emily just 2 days earlier to keep the memories tucked in, she'd said. William lowered himself to the floor beside the bed, not with grief, but with quiet purpose. He opened the photo album resting in his lap. The album was no longer blank. What had once been an empty gesture, a hopeful offering given to Rachel weeks ago, had become something fuller, warmer, and real. It wasn't just filled with photos, it was a collection of presents. On one page, a drawing of 3 stick figures labeled Me, Mommy, and Mr. H was bordered by glitter and gold stars. On another, a candid snapshot Rachel had taken of Emily asleep with a book on her chest, her other hand curled around Mr. Snuggles. There were photographs of the garden, the swing, a blurry close-up of a daisy that Emily had insisted belonged in the center spread because it was Lily's flower. William turned the pages slowly, letting each one anchor him to something living. Then he reached the photo Emily had taken of him, the one she framed with cardboard and glue and shy pride. He stared at it, still amazed that she'd managed to capture something human in him when he hadn't even noticed it was there. Below that, a newer photo had been taped. The three of them beneath the cherry tree, sunlight breaking across their faces, Rachel mid-laugh, Emily leaning into him, both hands holding his arm. A family photo, one he hadn't realized was being taken and hadn't known he needed. He didn't hear Emily come in. She was careful that way, not because she was sneaky, but because she had a strange respect for important moments, like she could sense when something needed silence to breathe. She crossed the room without speaking, holding Mr. Snuggles in both hands. The bear looked even more worn than before. The ribbon was frayed, the left ear had been stitched again, but he was clean and clearly loved. She stopped in front of William and crouched down until her knees touched the floor. "He wants to stay this time," she said simply, offering the bear the way she had the first time, as if Mr. Snuggles were capable of making decisions, and this one mattered most. William didn't smile, not right away. He looked at her, this small girl who had entered his life without fanfare and managed to stitch something back together inside him without asking anything in return. He took the bear gently and set him in his lap. "I think that's a good idea," he said. Emily nodded once, satisfied, and sat down beside him. She leaned into his arm the same way she had under the cherry tree, as if reminding him that she was staying too. A moment later, Rachel appeared in the doorway. She didn't speak, didn't ask to come in. She just stood there watching them. She looked different to him now, not in appearance, but in presence. She wasn't the housekeeper. She wasn't just Emily's mother. She was part of the story now. Her eyes met William's, and something passed between them that didn't need words. He reached into the album, turned to the last blank page, and pulled a pen from his shirt pocket. For a long second, he didn't write anything. He simply sat, as if waiting for the right words to come. Then slowly and carefully, he wrote in steady handwriting, "Family begins again here." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It wasn't sad. It was whole. Rachel's lips parted slightly, and though she didn't speak, a tear slid down her cheek. Not from grief, from relief, from recognition. William closed the album and placed it on the bed as if it belonged there, not as an artifact of the past, but as a marker of something new. Rachel stepped into the room at last, walking slowly over to them. She didn't ask if it was okay. She knew it was. She sat down on the other side of William, and Emily instinctively reached for her hand, connecting them in a line that didn't need explanation. No one spoke for a long while. They just sat there, connected by touch, by time, by things unspoken but deeply understood. The room that once held only silence now held weight. Of memory, yes, but also of presence, of laughter that had returned, of the soft way Emily said "we" instead of "me." Mr. Snuggles rested between them, no longer just a bearer of comfort, but a witness to change. Rachel placed her hand over William's without hesitation. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. Instead, he looked at her with something that resembled peace, not loud or dramatic, but real. A peace hard-earned and freely chosen. And so, on the anniversary of Lily's passing, William sat on the floor of her room, now filled with light and warmth, holding a full photo album in his lap, no longer a relic of the past, but a record of what had survived it. Emily had placed Mr. Snuggles in his lap once more and said with certainty, "He wants to stay this time." And when William looked up and saw Rachel in the doorway, watching, steady, present, he spoke the words he had been holding back until now. "So do I." He turned to the final page of the album, picked up his pen, and wrote what he now knew to be true. Family begins again here. We pour our hearts into every story we share here. Each one is crafted with care, hoping to bring a little warmth, reflection, and meaning into your day. If this story touched you in any way, please consider subscribing to our channel. It truly helps us keep bringing these heartfelt moments to life. Take a moment to explore our other videos, and if you feel comfortable, leave us a comment. We'd love to know what this story meant to you. Thank you for being here with us.